May 29th, 1453. A 15-year-old princess stands by a shattered window, watching the walls of her world collapse. Her name is Theodora Palaiologina, daughter of the last emperor of Byzantium, and in this moment she is neither royalty nor heir. She is a child clutching a burning piece of history. The marble floor beneath her trembles. Every cannon blast from across the Bosphorus shakes the foundations of the palace like the heartbeat of something dying. The air tastes of salt and smoke. The bronze bells of the Hagia Sophia ring frantically, calling for salvation that will never come. Outside, the city's defenders scream prayers into the thunder of war. Greek, Latin, Armenian voices blending into one desperate hymn. Theodora presses her hand against the cold glass. From her tower, she can see the Theodosian Walls, those legendary ramparts that had stood for 1,000 years, now cracking open under the relentless pounding of Ottoman cannons. Beyond the smoke, a sea of banners moves like a living tide. Red flags bearing the crescent, drums echoing in unison with the cannons, and above them all, the call to prayer. Allahu Akbar, rising like the city's final requiem. Her nurse bursts into the room crying, "The gate has fallen." Theodora turns, frozen between childhood and destiny. Somewhere below, her father is fighting with a sword too old and too sacred for this world. Constantine VI is the last emperor of Rome, and she knows, if he dies, so does everything their family name ever meant. Across the field, under the same burning sky, a 21-year-old sultan watches the destruction unfold with quiet precision. Mehmed II, son of Murad, stands before his great bronze cannons, their barrels smoking with the heat of conquest. He does not smile. He does not cheer. He simply watches. Around him, his generals shout reports. The gate of St. Romanus is breached. The city is open, but Mehmed raises a gloved hand for silence. To him, this moment is not victory. It is destiny fulfilled. He looks upon the same skyline Theodora sees, but where she sees ruin, he sees resurrection. For him, this is not the death of a city. It is the birth of an empire. The cannons roar again, and Mehmed whispers something only those closest to him hear. At last, Rome kneels, but even he does not know what will follow. In the next 72 hours, his fate and hers will twist into something history almost refused to remember. Inside the palace, Theodora's world burns. Smoke pours through corridors painted with saints and emperors. Servants flee with icons clutched to their chests. Theodora stumbles through the chaos, searching for her mother, her brothers, anyone still alive. The screams outside blend with the crashing of marble and the crackling of fire. Somewhere beyond the din, she hears the chants of invading soldiers, rhythmic, triumphant, unstoppable. She hides behind a tapestry as the doors burst open. Steel boots thunder through the hallway. She clutches the small gold cross around her neck, whispering prayers through trembling lips, not for safety, but for remembrance. Because even then, she knows the truth. Empires don't die when their walls fall. They die when no one remembers what it felt like to live inside them. As the sun rises over the smoking city, two destinies draw closer. A girl whose bloodline ends today, and a conqueror whose empire begins with her silence. What he did next would shock even his generals. And what happened in the next 72 hours, history tried to erase. If you've ever wondered what really happened when royal families faced their conquerors at the gates, stay with me. Because this is not the story of a city's fall, it's the story of what survived it. 57 days earlier, the dawn broke over the Sea of Marmara, red as blood on the horizon, as the greatest army of its age encircled the last jewel of the ancient world. 80,000 Ottoman soldiers stood before the mighty walls of Constantinople, engineers, janissaries, cavalry, and mercenaries, their camp stretching from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara like a living, breathing storm. 200 warships waited offshore, their black sails casting shadows over the water. And behind them all, the Sultan's cannon, a bronze monster 27 feet long, forged by the Hungarian engineer Orban, capable of firing a 1,200-pound stone ball that could shatter stone like glass. The Sultan's order was simple. The city that defied Islam for 1,000 years will kneel before the crescent. But inside those walls, the last defenders of Rome refused to die quietly. The defenders numbered only 7,000, a patchwork of exhausted Greeks, Italians, Spaniards, and mercenaries from Genoa, men who had seen too many wars and knew they wouldn't live to see another. At their head stood Emperor Constantine VII Paleologos, a man of 48 with tired eyes and a soldier's heart. He had no heir, no escape plan, and no illusions. He fought not for victory, but for dignity, for the idea that even as the empire crumbled, its courage would not. When his commanders begged him to surrender, he gathered them in the throne room of Blachernay Palace. Candles flickered across mosaics of ancient emperors. The emperor's voice was calm, steady, the kind of calm that only comes from accepting one's fate. "My brothers," he said, "to surrender the city is beyond my authority or anyone's who lives in it, for we have all decided to die of our own free will. Let no man fear death today, for what we defend is not just our walls, but our faith, our name, and the memory of Rome itself." Silence followed. Then one by one the men crossed themselves, bowed their heads, and returned to the ramparts. They were soldiers of a dying empire, but in that moment they were eternal. Every day after that was a test of endurance. The Ottoman cannons fired without mercy, pounding the Theodosian Walls, those same walls that had repelled Persians, Arabs, and Crusaders for 1,000 years. The ground shook as stones weighing more than a horse smashed into towers that had stood since the days of Constantine the Great. Each explosion sent dust and marble raining down onto the defenders below. The air smelled of gunpowder, wet earth, and despair. At night, the citizens gathered in churches to pray, the flicker of oil lamps painting gold halos on their tear-streaked faces. The Hagia Sophia, once the grandest cathedral in the world, became a refuge of hope. Priests carried icons through the streets, the Virgin, the saints, the Emperor Constantine himself, begging heaven to intervene. Outside, fires lit up the Ottoman camps, a sea of tents and banners stretching beyond sight. Within the palace, life had become a haunting echo of the past. Theodora, the emperor's 15-year-old cousin, would often wake to the rumble of cannons in the distance, her heart pounding in time with their rhythm. She could hear the faint shouts of soldiers through the marble corridors, the distant chants of Allahu Akbar, carried on the wind. Her mother, Lady Euphron, would hold her close and whisper, "Don't be afraid, my child. As long as the bells of Hagia Sophia still ring, the city lives." But even she no longer believed her own words. By the 35th day, hunger began to break them. The markets were empty. Cats and dogs disappeared from the streets. Mothers mixed sawdust into bread. Priests urged the people to endure, that deliverance would come from Venice or Genoa, but no ships appeared on the horizon. Still, the defenders refused to yield. Every time the Ottomans filled the moat, the Byzantines dug it deeper. Every time a wall collapsed, they rebuilt it with rubble and prayer. Even Mehmed himself began to grow impatient. He had promised his army 3 days of pillage, the ancient right of conquerors who took a city by force. Every man in his camp dreamed of gold, slaves, and glory, and every day that the walls still stood, their hunger grew. The Sultan's advisors urged him to call off the siege before his army revolted. But Mehmed shook his head. He had not come this far to retreat. He wanted the city, not for plunder, but for immortality. Inside, the people of Constantinople began to understand what awaited them if the city fell. They knew the law. 3 days of chaos when every man, woman, and child captured would belong to the conqueror. The churches filled to bursting as priests offered last confessions, last blessings. Children were baptized in secret. Families sealed their doors with wax and prayers. They did not pray for life anymore, only for dignity in death. And through it all, the bells kept ringing hour after hour, drowning out the thunder of the cannons. To those who lived within the walls, it was not noise. It was defiance, the heartbeat of a city that refused to die. The siege had become more than war. It was a contest between faith and fate, between a dying empire's courage and a young sultan's obsession. But as the 57th dawn rose, both sides would learn that the end of the world doesn't come with a roar, it comes with a whisper. She had been born into silk and ceremony, not war. Theodora Paleologina was raised in the candlelit corridors of Blachernay Palace, where marble floors gleamed like water and tutors spoke of philosophy, virtue, and diplomacy. She was meant to become a bride of peace, perhaps to a Venetian noble or a Balkan prince, a union meant to preserve alliances, not survive empires. Her childhood was filled with the smell of beeswax and parchment, not smoke and blood. She learned to play the lyre, to read Homer and Plato, to speak in the measured tones of the court. And yet, behind those lessons was a silence, the unspoken truth that her family's empire was dying. She saw it in the servants' eyes, heard it in the hollow footsteps of courtiers who no longer believed in tomorrow. Her understanding of politics was shallow but sincere. She had listened to her tutors describe the Ottoman threat as something distant, a storm always rumored, never real. But she also saw her uncle, Emperor Constantine, walking through the palace gardens alone at night, hands clasped behind his back, whispering prayers to saints who no longer answered. Theodora longed not for power, but for the one thing her dynasty had never known: peace. She believed, as only the young can, that goodness might persuade destiny to be kind. She did not yet understand that kindness has no power against ambition. On the other side of the Bosphorus, another youth carried a crown heavier than steel. Sultan Mehmed, 21 years old, ruler of the Ottomans, stood at the threshold of legend. Yet for all his armies, he was haunted by doubt. To Europe, he was the boy sultan, a child ruler mocked in letters from Venice and Rome. To his own generals, he was a gamble, a scholar pretending to be a conqueror. His father, Murad II, had been the warrior every empire feared. Mehmed was the son who had inherited not just power, but expectation. He was not tall nor graceful, but his eyes burned with an intelligence that unsettled even his elders. He spoke 6 languages: Turkish, Greek, Latin, Arabic, Persian, and Hebrew. He could recite the Quran as easily as he could quote Aristotle. In his tent, beside maps and siege plans, lay a worn copy of Arrian's Campaigns of Alexander. He read it before sleeping, tracing the lines of conquest with his fingertips as though memorizing prophecy. He didn't dream of gold or vengeance, only immortality. Constantinople was his destiny, the bridge between East and West, Islam and Christendom, myth and reality. To capture it was to become not just Sultan, but Caesar. And yet, beneath the armor of ambition, there was something fragile, a boy still seeking his father's approval, still trying to prove to the world that he was more than the shadow of Murad. He had failed once before. At 12, crowned too soon, he was humiliated when his father had to reclaim the throne after a military rebellion. Now, years later, Mehmed had returned, hardened and ruthless, determined that no one would ever question him again. The siege of Constantinople was not just a campaign. It was a trial by fire, and failure would mean the end of his reign, perhaps his life. Both Theodora and Mehmed lived within cages built of expectation, one gilded, one forged in iron. She represented a civilization at its twilight. He embodied a world being born in its place. She prayed for dawn, he commanded it. Both were surrounded by men twice their age, all pretending to serve while secretly doubting youth's right to rule. And both, in their quietest hours, wondered what kind of gods demanded such cruelty for greatness. Theodora spent her days in the palace library, reading by candlelight, the rumble of distant cannons like a storm she tried to ignore. Mehmed spent his nights in his war tent, sketching siege diagrams in the dirt, whispering to himself, "Rome must fall for me to rise." Neither could sleep. The city between them was both cradle and tomb, the living heart of history itself, waiting to decide which youth would define its final chapter. In another life, they might have met as scholars, perhaps even friends, 2 prodigies of fallen dynasties, speaking in Greek beneath the mosaics of Hagia Sophia. But history never allows such mercies. Fate had already written them into opposite pages of the same story, one to inherit the ashes, the other to survive them. And so, as the siege thundered on, 2 young souls, each burdened with the weight of empires, stared into the same night sky, he beneath the banners of the crescent, she behind walls lit by dying candles. Neither knew the other existed, yet within 72 hours, one would decide the other's fate. The night before the end began with an eerie stillness, as though even the sea itself was holding its breath. May 28, 1453, the last night of Byzantium. The city that had outlasted empires lay wrapped in candlelight and dread. In the imperial palace, Emperor Constantine VI sat alone, his armor polished, his crown placed beside him like a relic of another age. Messengers had come and gone throughout the day, their faces pale with exhaustion. By evening, the Sultan's terms arrived. One final chance to surrender, to leave the city peacefully, to live under Ottoman protection. It was, in truth, an act of calculated mercy. But for Constantine, it was the one mercy he could not accept. He gathered his remaining generals and clerics in the throne room of Blachernay Palace. The walls still shimmered faintly with the gold leaf of ancient mosaics, chipped by tremors from the cannon fire outside. "The Sultan offers us life," one of his men whispered, "and all he asks is the city." The emperor rose slowly, his face lit by torchlight. He was no longer a ruler now, only a man choosing how to die. "To surrender the city," he said quietly, "is beyond my authority or anyone's who lives in it. For all of us have decided to die of our own free will." No one spoke after that. The silence that followed was sacred, heavier than any prayer. That night, the citizens of Constantinople gathered in the Hagia Sophia for one last liturgy. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Orthodox and the Catholics prayed together, their centuries of division dissolving under the shadow of death. The vast dome flickered with candlelight, golden mosaics reflecting the glow like fragments of heaven itself. Priests carried relics through the crowd crosses, icons, and the shroud of the Virgin. Soldiers knelt beside merchants, women beside monks, all singing hymns that trembled through the marble like heartbeat and memory. The emperor himself entered near midnight, unarmed, his eyes wet as he knelt before the altar. "Forgive me," he whispered to the priests beside him, "for the sins of my reign." Outside, the wind carried the faint rhythm of Ottoman drums. The people pretended not to hear. They prayed louder. Their voices rose higher. The air itself seemed to hum with grief and defiance. It was said that even the Sultan's sentries could hear the chants drifting over the walls, a sound that made some weep. Others tightened their grip on their swords. In a quiet chamber near the palace kitchens, Lady Euphron prepared her daughter for the unthinkable. Theodora sat on a wooden stool as her mother took a knife and began to cut her hair. The locks fell silently onto the stone floor, each snip sounding louder than the cannons outside. Then Euphron rubbed soot across her daughter's cheeks and hands until her skin was dark and smudged. She dressed her in coarse wool, the color of ash. Theodora stared at her reflection in a small bronze mirror and no longer saw a princess. She saw a servant. "If you look like one of them," her mother said, her voice trembling, "maybe God will hide you among them." Theodora wanted to protest, to refuse, to stay by her mother's side no matter what came, but the words never formed. She understood in that silent exchange that survival was not cowardice. It was the last duty left to the living. "Mother," she whispered, "if the city falls." Euphron pressed a hand to her lips. "Do not speak of endings, child, only of tomorrow. Promise me you'll live to see another dawn." The girl nodded, though she did not believe it. Her heart ached with shame. The streets outside echoed with prayer, with courage, with men ready to die. And here she was, preparing to hide. Yet some deeper part of her understood that courage takes many forms. The emperor would face the sword, she would face the silence that followed. In the distance, the great bells of Hagia Sophia rang through the night, slow, steady, unending. Theodora stood at the window, watching the faint orange glow of the Ottoman fires beyond the walls. She could see, far away, the flash of torches moving like a serpent across the plain. The city's defenders still stood at their posts, tired shadows on ramparts that had protected Christendom for 1,000 years. Behind her, her mother wrapped a small wooden cross in a strip of linen and slipped it into her hand. "Keep this hidden," she whispered. "When you hear the cannons again, go where they keep the servants. And do not look back." Theodora closed her fingers around the cross. It felt warm, alive, as if carrying the heartbeat of her ancestors. Somewhere beyond the darkness, she could almost imagine hearing the sea against the harbor, soft and rhythmic, as though the city itself was breathing one last time. She wanted to remember it that way, not as a place of fire and ruin, but as a home that had once believed in eternity. The prayers from Hagia Sophia swelled louder, echoing through the empty courtyards. Men sang psalms, women wept, torches flickered. Theodora sank to her knees and pressed her forehead to the floor. "If it is your will," she whispered, "let me live not as a princess, but as a witness." Outside, the wind shifted. Across the plain, deep and distant, came the sound no one mistook, the low, heavy rumble of cannons being loaded. The hymns rose higher under the golden dome, and in that fragile harmony of faith and fear, the last night of Byzantium began to fade into its final dawn. Dawn came not with light, but with sound. A deep, rhythmic thunder rolled across the plains, Ottoman war drums beating in perfect unison. From every hill, from every siege line, came the echo of tens of thousands of voices shouting, "Allahu Akbar." The cry was not of hatred, but of destiny, a tide of faith and fury crashing against the last walls of Christendom. The sky above Constantinople turned gray as cannon smoke thickened, blotting out the morning sun. Every window trembled, every prayer faltered. And yet, from within the dying city, church bells answered, a final, desperate defiance against the storm. The first wave came at dawn. They were irregular troops, unpaid zealots, slaves, adventurers from the far corners of the empire. Driven by greed more than glory, they surged toward the walls like a living flood. Arrows and boiling oil rained down upon them. The Byzantine defenders, though starving and exhausted, fought with the madness of those who have nothing left to lose. Crossbows twanged, catapults fired stones, and Greek fire turned men into torches that screamed. Hundreds of attackers fell, their bodies piling at the base of the Theodosian Walls. The ground turned slick, the air thick with burning flesh. Yet for every man who fell, another came forward, stepping over corpses toward a gate that would not yield. As the first wave broke and retreated in chaos, the second began. Disciplined Anatolian soldiers, trained and hardened. Mehmed's generals raised green flags and gave the order. The cannons roared again, tearing deeper into the shattered defenses. The defenders could no longer repair the breaches. They had run out of stone, of mortar, of time. Emperor Constantine rode along the walls, shouting to his men, "Hold the line! Hold it for the faith, for the city, for your children!" His voice was hoarse, but it carried above the din. Behind him, priests lifted icons to the sky, blessing the dying and the living alike. The second wave pressed forward relentlessly. They filled the moats with the dead. They climbed over ladders slick with blood. Inside the city, every bell of Hagia Sophia rang without pause, not in triumph, but in mourning. Smoke drifted through the air like shrouds. And then, a small mistake, a moment that would change the world. Near the northern sector, at a lesser-known gate called Kirkoporta, someone forgot to lock the postern door after a counterattack. A handful of Ottoman soldiers noticed. They slipped in silently, cutting down the few guards who remained. By the time the alarm spread, it was too late. The flood had found its crack. From there, chaos erupted. Janissaries, the Sultan's elite, his pride, surged forward in perfect formation. They were not like the others. They did not scream, did not chant. They moved like clockwork, silent and merciless. At their head rode Ulubatli Hassan, a young warrior carrying the green banner of the Prophet. He scaled the broken wall under a storm of arrows and stones, wounded again and again, but never stopped. When he finally reached the top, he planted the Ottoman flag upon the battlement. The cry that followed was unlike anything the city had ever heard, half triumph, half terror. The defenders faltered. For the first time in 1,000 years, an enemy standard waved over Constantinople. Emperor Constantine saw it from the southern gate. His face went pale, but his eyes burned brighter. "The city has fallen," he shouted, drawing his sword, "and I am still alive." Then he charged, into the swarm, into legend. He vanished in the crush of men, never to be seen again. Some said he died fighting, others swore they saw him kneel before the altar of Hagia Sophia. History will never know. The walls crumbled, the gates burst, and the Ottomans poured in like fire through dry reeds. The streets filled with smoke, screams, and prayers. The marble turned red. Soldiers fought in doorways. Priests clutched crosses as janissaries stormed through sanctuaries. The scent of blood mixed with incense. Horses slipped on corpses. Mothers gathered children under icons, whispering psalms as iron boots shattered the doors. The holy city, once the envy of the world, burned beneath a sky that no longer distinguished between heaven and hell. In a small storeroom behind the palace kitchens, Theodora huddled between oil jars, her breath shallow, her body shaking. Through the cracks in the wood, she saw flashes of fire, heard the clash of steel, the cries for mercy that went unanswered. Once, a soldier stumbled into the room, his armor dripping red. He looked right at her, but saw only shadows, and left. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. She could smell the oil, the smoke, the salt of her own tears. Each sound outside, each scream, felt like another piece of her world being torn apart. By midday, the city was a furnace. Hagia Sophia itself became a refuge and then a trap. Thousands fled inside, believing the sacred dome would protect them. But when the Janissaries entered, they found no sanctuary, only a multitude praying for deliverance that never came. The marble floor ran red where once emperors had knelt. The cross above the altar still gleamed, but its light was drowned in shadow. Far from the chaos, Sultan Mehmed stood on a rise overlooking the city, his armor gleaming in the smoke. He did not smile. His generals cheered, but he remained silent, staring at the skyline where domes burned and towers fell. The victory he had dreamed of since boyhood now weighed upon him like stone. He whispered, "So this is what it costs to be eternal." Below, the drums slowed. The shouts faded into the crackle of flames. The waves of the Bosphorus lapped quietly against the shore, carrying ash instead of petals. And as noon came, the smoke thinned enough for the sun to pierce through once more, pale, indifferent, eternal. By noon, the Queen of Cities was no more. The air inside the throne room was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Once the heart of a civilization, it now looked like the ribcage of something slaughtered. Marble-cracked, golden mosaics blackened by soot and torn banners of the double-headed eagle hanging like ghosts from the ceiling. The great bronze doors stood open to the scorched courtyard beyond, where flames still licked the sky. Through them, Ottoman soldiers dragged the last of the nobles, priests, and servants, the remnants of Byzantium, to kneel before their new master. At the far end, Sultan Mehmed sat upon the shattered throne of Constantine. His armor glinted beneath the dim light of broken chandeliers, his turban immaculate, his gaze sharp as a drawn blade. Behind him, the banner of the crescent moon fluttered faintly in the smoke-filled air. Around him stood his viziers, janissary captains, and translators, all silent, all waiting. A wounded priest was the first to be thrown before him, muttering prayers through bloodied lips. Mehmed gestured for him to stand. "Your God has not abandoned you," he said softly. "He only changes names." The priest's eyes filled with tears. He was led away. Next came two nobles, their robes torn, their hands bound. One begged for mercy, the other spat in defiance. The Sultan regarded them both with the same calm detachment, as if their fates had been decided long before this day. Then came a girl in servant's clothing, her hair short, her hands dark with soot. She stumbled as soldiers pushed her forward, falling to her knees before the conqueror. Her eyes were wide, not with pride or hatred, but with a kind of terrified wonder, as though she could not believe she was still alive. The court had grown used to screams, but her silence drew their attention. Something in the way she moved, the quiet grace, the measured stillness, did not belong to a servant. The translator stepped forward, glancing uncertainly between her and the Sultan. "This one," he said in Turkish, "claims to be a servant, my lord." Mehmed's gaze did not waver. "A servant," he repeated, his tone quiet, almost curious. Then, in perfect Latin, he asked, "What is your name?" Theodora froze. Her mind screamed for silence, for deception. But instinct, the same instinct that had once made her a princess, betrayed her. She answered softly, also in Latin, "My name is Theodora." A murmur rippled through the court. The translator blinked, startled. Mehmed leaned forward slightly, studying her face. "A servant who speaks Latin?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Who taught you?" Theodora swallowed. "My father was a scholar in the palace. He is dead." The Sultan's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps pity, perhaps calculation. He rose slowly from the throne and descended the steps, his silk robes brushing against the soot-covered marble. The crowd parted in silence. He stopped before her. She dared not look up. The scent of sandalwood and steel filled her lungs. He reached out, and for a moment she thought he would strike her. Instead, he tilted her chin upward with the edge of his gauntlet. Their eyes met, the conqueror and the conquered, two young souls bound by a fate neither had chosen. Her voice trembled. "If you mean to kill me, my lord, do it now." He studied her quietly, the room frozen in suspense. Around them, soldiers shifted uneasily, waiting for the gesture that would decide her fate. It would be so easy, a single command, and her blood would join the thousands already spilled that day. But Mehmed did not speak. He saw the terror, yes, but also something else, the unmistakable dignity of someone who had lost everything yet still refused to crawl. It reminded him of his mother's stories of noble women in old epics, of queens who faced their end without breaking. And perhaps, somewhere deep within him, a voice whispered that conquest meant nothing if it could not recognize beauty in what it destroyed. The tension in the room was unbearable. The translator cleared his throat softly. "Shall I?" he began, but Mehmed raised a hand to silence him. He stepped back, looking at her one last time, then turned to his generals. "She is no threat," he said quietly. "Leave her." But his men hesitated. To spare a noblewoman, especially one of imperial blood, was unthinkable. It could be seen as weakness, as sacrilege to the victory they had bled for. One captain dared to speak. "My lord, she wears the robes of the enemy. If she is of royal blood, her death would seal the end of their line." Mehmed turned his gaze on him, cold, lethal. "And yet, it is I who decide what ends and what does not." He walked back to the throne, every eye following him. The air seemed to vibrate with the weight of what might come next. Theodora still knelt on the marble floor, her hands trembling, her pulse roaring in her ears. The Sultan sat once more, resting his sword across his knees. The light from the burning city flickered through the broken windows, painting his face and shifting gold and red. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Mehmed spoke, not in anger, not in triumph, but with an almost sorrowful calm. And then, the witnesses would later whisper, he said 4 words that froze everyone in the room. "Bring her to safety." For a long moment after those 4 words, "Bring her to safety," the room remained utterly still. The Conqueror's voice had carried through smoke and ruin like the breaking of a spell. The janissaries who had filled the throne room with blades and armor now looked uncertain, as if their victory had been briefly suspended in midair. Even the translators hesitated, unsure whether they had heard correctly. Mehmed's eyes did not leave Theodora's face. He spoke again, slower this time, making sure the words would carve themselves into the air for all to hear. "Release her. Protect her. Give her a home." The command struck harder than any blow. Around him, hardened generals who had marched through cities from the Balkans to Anatolia stared at their sultan in disbelief. Some exchanged wary glances, others frowned, unable to reconcile mercy with conquest. One, an old vizier named Halil Pasha, dared to step forward. "My sultan," he said carefully, "the girl is of imperial blood. If she lives, she is a symbol. Symbols have power long after thrones are gone." Mehmed turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "So let her be a symbol," he replied, "but of what I decide." That single sentence silenced the room. He rose from the throne, stepping down onto the cracked marble. "Do you know why empires fall, Halil?" he asked quietly. "Because men believe the sword is enough. They mistake fear for obedience." He paced slowly before his generals, the golden tassels of his cloak brushing the ashes on the floor. "But the Romans ruled 1,000 years because they built meaning from the ruins they conquered. They took the best of their enemies, their engineers, their scholars, their laws, and made them Roman." He looked toward the distant horizon, where the fires of the city still burned. "We will do the same. I will not destroy Rome. I will inherit it." It was in that moment that Mehmed revealed what truly drove him. Not vengeance, not faith, but legacy. He had grown up mocked as the boy sultan, dismissed by European courts as a barbarian prince destined to fail. He had studied Alexander's campaigns not for bloodlust but for immortality. To him, the conquest of Constantinople was not an ending, it was a coronation. To be Caesar of Rome, he needed more than victory, he needed legitimacy. And legitimacy, he knew, was not forged in slaughter. It was written in mercy. Later historians would interpret his decision to spare Theodora as compassion, perhaps even attraction. But in truth, it was far more strategic and infinitely more dangerous. By protecting the last surviving princess of Byzantium, he positioned himself as her successor, not her destroyer. Her survival became a silent seal upon his claim. The lineage of Rome continued through him. In the days that followed, Theodora was escorted under guard to a villa in the Fenier district, far from the ruins of the palace. Ottoman scribes recorded her name under an alias, and she was given a small stipend for her upkeep and dignity. Mehmed assigned eunuchs to guard her, not as prisoners, but as protectors. No one was to harm her. No one was to speak her true lineage aloud. When questioned by his court chronicler, Mehmed reportedly said, "Let the world see that even in victory I am just. Let them see that Rome has not perished, it has changed its tongue." He was consistent in that vision. Within months, he reinstated the Patriarchate of Constantinople, appointing Gennadios Scholarios, a Greek scholar and theologian, as its leader. He promised religious autonomy to the Orthodox Church, ensuring the cooperation of its people. He summoned Greek philosophers to his court, offering them patronage in exchange for knowledge. The man who had burned the gates of Constantinople now funded the preservation of its libraries. For the Western world, it was a contradiction they could not understand. For Mehmed, it was calculation. Mercy became his greatest weapon, a tool to reshape perception, to turn conquest into legitimacy. Even as Europe mourned Byzantium, its scholars began to migrate westward, carrying manuscripts, art, and knowledge that would soon ignite the Renaissance. Mehmed knew this would happen. In his eyes, the fall of one empire was simply the rebirth of another. Records discovered centuries later, including Ottoman archives and Greek correspondences, confirmed that a woman identified as Theodora of the imperial house received protection and a modest pension until her death. The records note her as quiet, respectful, and under divine favor. Historians long dismissed it as rumor, until 2009, when translations of Mehmed's endowment charters explicitly mentioned her stipend among those of special royal consideration. It was more than mercy. It was theater, deliberate, calculated, and revolutionary. Mehmed understood that history would remember him, not for the bodies that filled the Bosphorus, but for the civilization that rose from the ashes. He had turned a slaughter into a statement. True conquest is not destruction, it is absorption. Theodora, once the daughter of a dying world, became the living emblem of that philosophy. She was Rome's last echo and Islam's new proof. A quiet, breathing reminder that one empire had not ended, it had merely changed masters. When a European envoy once asked him if he regretted sparing her, Mehmed is said to have smiled faintly and replied, "Empires survive not by fear alone, but by who they choose to spare." And with that, the boy sultan who had dreamed of immortality ensured that his empire and his name would outlive them all. In the months that followed the fall, the city of emperors transformed into something both unfamiliar and eternal. The fires dimmed, the smoke lifted, and life, hesitant, fractured, but resilient, began to return. Theodora lived quietly in the Fenner district, a small quarter near the Golden Horn where the air smelled of salt and new beginnings. The once princess became a shadow among commoners, her past spoken only in whispers. Ottoman guards watched discreetly from a distance, ensuring no harm would come to her, yet reminding her each day that she lived at the Sultan's mercy. She never returned to the palace, nor to Hagia Sophia. Both belonged to another world now. Still, every dawn she could hear the faint echo of the muezzin's call to prayer from the newly consecrated mosque, the same dome where her people had sung their last liturgy. The Hagia Sophia, once the beating heart of orthodoxy, now bore Arabic calligraphy beneath its golden arches, and yet its beauty remained untouched. Mehmed had commanded that it not be desecrated, but preserved. "It shall remain," he said, "as proof that empires do not die, they evolve." In that he was true to his word. The Sultan made Constantinople the new capital of the world, a crossroads where East met West under his rule. He called it Istanbul, the city of Islam, yet the name still carried the echo of its Greek roots. Markets reopened, scholars were invited, and the streets once again filled with the murmur of trade and prayer. From Italy, artisans came seeking patronage. From Anatolia and Persia came architects, engineers, and calligraphers. The ruined skyline soon bristled with domes and minarets, a new Rome rising from ashes, this time with crescents instead of crosses. Mehmed was not merely a conqueror, he was a builder of legacies. He collected manuscripts from conquered lands, commissioning translations of Plato, Aristotle, and Ptolemy into Arabic and Ottoman Turkish. He funded academies where Muslim scholars debated side by side with Greek philosophers. To him, knowledge was the true empire, and he intended to rule it as completely as he ruled his armies. It was within this strange fusion of East and West that a subtle miracle unfolded. The scattered Byzantine scholars who fled to Italy carried with them not despair, but enlightenment. Their teachings, philosophies, and preserved texts became the spark that would ignite the European Renaissance. It was the great irony of history that the fall of one empire would become the birth of another world. The knowledge that Mehmed's cannons had toppled was the same knowledge that would soon lift humanity toward the modern age. Greek texts found refuge in Florence, Venice, and Rome. Artists studied Byzantine icons and learned the secrets of light and perspective from fallen masters. Humanism, science, and art began to bloom, nourished by the intellectual ashes of Constantinople. Theodora never knew it, but her world's end became the world's rebirth. In her small garden overlooking the Bosphorus, she often sat at dusk watching ships drift past. Turkish galleys now, not Byzantine triremes. Sometimes the Sultan's own fleet would sail by, their banners gold in the evening light. She would close her eyes and listen to the rhythm of the oars, remembering the drums that once heralded destruction. Time had turned those drums into heartbeat again. Years softened her grief into acceptance. Under the protection of the Sultan's edict, she eventually married, not for politics, but peace. Her husband was a Greek physician who had once served the imperial court. Together they lived quietly, teaching children to read and tending the sick of their quarter. To the neighbors, she was simply Lady Dora, a widow of the old nobility perhaps, nothing more. The truth of her bloodline faded like a rumor no one dared confirm. When Mehmed rode through the city years later, she saw him only once, from afar, as he passed along the newly rebuilt walls. He was no longer the boy who had stood among ruins. He was now the emperor of two worlds, commanding armies that stretched from the Balkans to Arabia. Yet when their eyes met across the distance, there was no triumph in his gaze, only recognition. A silent understanding that both had survived the death of a world neither had asked to end. History, however, would not be as kind. In the Chronicles of the West, Theodora's name was erased. To admit that mercy had been shown to a Byzantine princess would have complicated the narrative of barbarity that Europe needed. Likewise, Ottoman scribes omitted her from their records. To immortalize compassion toward the enemy might have weakened the image of divine conquest. Thus, both victors and victims found reason to forget her. Her story was lost in the space between pride and propaganda, too inconvenient for both sides. For centuries she existed only as rumor, her life hidden behind the veil of politics and faith. Yet the ripples of her survival could be felt in subtler ways, in the Sultan's tolerance toward scholars, in the quiet restoration of Greek churches, in the coexistence of cultures that defined Istanbul for generations. In her final years, Theodora wrote no memoirs, left no inscriptions. She lived simply, teaching the language of Homer to the children of the conquerors. It was said that she died peacefully in her sleep, holding a small wooden cross, the same her mother had pressed into her palm the night before the fall. She was buried near the harbor, in an unmarked grave facing the water. No tomb, no crown, no epitaph, only the sea, whispering the story history tried to forget. And yet, in the greater arc of time, her survival and his mercy intertwined like threads of gold through a tapestry of blood. From that unlikely bond, between the conqueror and the conquered, rose the very world we now inhabit. Because in the ashes of Constantinople, something extraordinary was born. The empire had fallen, but civilization, reborn through mercy, knowledge, and memory, had just begun to rise. 15 years before she became a shadow in a foreign city, Theodora had stood at her window, a 15-year-old girl watching her world collapse beneath cannon fire. The marble trembled, the sky turned black, and somewhere beyond the smoke, a young man, barely older than she, watched the same dawn through the haze of victory. She was the last child of Byzantium. He was the first emperor of a new world. History would remember one as the conqueror and forget the other entirely. Yet for a brief moment, their stories crossed, and mercy, not power, wrote the final line of an empire. History, of course, does not weep. It categorizes. It simplifies. It remembers conquerors as monsters or saints, rarely both. Mehmed was called the terrible Turk by the West and the faithful Sultan by his own people. But truth, as always, lived between the ruins. To the dying Byzantines, he was Apocalypse. To the scholars who fled to Italy, he was the man who saved their books from fire. To Theodora, he was neither hero nor villain, merely a boy who chose not to finish what fate had begun. Empires end not when cities fall, but when compassion becomes strategy. Mehmed understood that a sword could take land, but only mercy could take history. Theodora's life, hidden, erased, yet quietly preserved, became proof that even in conquest there can exist a flicker of conscience. Her survival was no accident. It was the deliberate act of a man who sought to rule not only bodies, but memory itself. For centuries, her story was buried under silence. Western chroniclers denied her existence. Ottoman records mentioned her only in euphemism. But truth has a strange way of surfacing. In 2009, Ottoman endowment documents were re-examined by historians at Istanbul University, revealing a stipend assigned to Theodora of imperial descent. And in 2017, Greek archival research confirmed the same name appearing in correspondence between Patriarch Gennadios and the Sultan's scribes, proof that she had lived under Mehmed's protection until her death. What both sides tried to bury, time quietly preserved. The image returns. The girl at the window, and the man who took her world. Between them lay not hatred, but the fragile understanding that power without mercy is ash. And that is perhaps why Constantinople still stands, not as a relic of conquest, but as a monument to continuity. If this story changed how you see conquerors and conquered, subscribe for next week's forgotten chapter, The Secret Life of Constantine's Wife and the Final Heir of Rome. Because history's darkest secrets are never lost, only waiting to be found.